This podcast is a production of the Brickyard Network, an extension of the Archie Bray Foundation for the Ceramic Arts. To find out more about our lineup of ceramic podcasts, visit brickyardnetwork.org.
Hey, this is Erin with Cornell Studio Supply located in Dayton, Ohio, exclusive distributor of Jen Allen templates and Put a Lid on It t-shirts. We are a proud sponsor of this episode and the Brickyard Network. Find all your pottery and ceramic sculpture needs, including the largest stock of GR pottery forms at cornellstudiosupply.com. At Cornell Studio Supply, we are owned and operated for potters, by potters.
Welcome to the Tales of a Red Clay Rambler podcast, featuring interviews with culture makers from around the world. This is Ben Carter. I'm going to be your host. If you'd like more information on the show, please visit our website, talesofaredclayrambler.com. Welcome back to episode 516 of the podcast. Thank you all for tuning in. Today on the show, I talk with Rhonda Willers. She uses functional pottery, sculptural vessels, and installation to explore ideas of fragility and the passage of time. In our interview, we talk about her installation Alone Together, her work in ceramics, and her book Terra Sigillata: Contemporary Techniques. We also discuss her philosophy of service work, of which she has done a lot with the Enseca organization, and her podcast, The Artist in Me is Dead, which traces creativity through the lives of makers. If you'd like to find out more, you can go to rhondawillers.com. Before we get to today's interview, I wanted to thank the folks that have recently donated to our podcast. We are listener supported, so I couldn't do this without the support of folks like Naomi Clement and Courtney Hilliard. If you'd like to get involved yourself, you can do that at talesofaredclayrambler.com/donate. Without further ado, we'll get to the interview. In the life of an artist, so many opportunities come to us in which we are not yet prepared, but after we go through the experience, we will be prepared. Basically, you have to grow into positions or experiences. Can you talk about how you've been able to do that as an artist?
Well, I think my first step into art even felt like that to me because I hadn't believed or known that this was a path that people did professionally. So I started, studying English education and horticulture at a university. And art came through a total, a professor walked by while I was drawing in an art class and said, "You're pretty good at that. You should take a drawing class." That was it. And I was like, yeah, I'm taking a drawing class the next semester. So, and I always left room in my schedule to explore because I felt it was important to take one class every year. But when I think about stepping into that space, having no concept of where it might lead, what I knew was the instant connection of loving the experience of being engrossed in observation in the case of drawing, and that I loved that I could pay attention to something small or unusual and that was celebrated rather than questioned. And I think that was probably a starting place for me and why art kind of came to be. And in terms of my art practice overall, I'm just thinking about people who have asked me to do things at different points. I am trying to give a good specific example of when I felt like I said yes, and I was like, oh boy, I do not know if I know how to do this kind of thing. I think that, it started actually even in teaching too, where I was just asked on the fly, like a weekend before a semester started, if I would teach a class. And I said yes. And And I was like, well, I took that class when I was a student and it was at the school I had been a student. So I was like, sure, I can figure this out. And I was working in a commercial photography place at the same time. And I was like, great, I can do both these things. And I just knew that I cared about teaching. And I knew that that class was the class that changed for me, my life in that sense. Um, so I think that in general, I have a disposition of trusting that when I feel the yes in me, that then I will be able to meet whatever that is. And in my own work, some of my most favorite things have come out of just trying something small that seems like a sort of strange idea, and then it grows into the next thing. And so I think that that is my practice as much as it is my disposition.
As I was researching you, I was trying to like put you into categories, and you're in all the categories. You make pots, you're a sculptor, you're an author, you're a podcaster, you've done a lot of work with NSECA and other organizations. So in a way, you've had this really multifaceted approach, and it just struck me how much faith you must have in yourself to say yes to something like writing a book or being a podcast host, because they're skills that you don't get until you're doing the thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that that started early for me, probably as early as high school is when I can remember first having that kind of disposition of like trust in self. And I don't often worry whether it will work out. I often just think like, okay, build a path. Like I'm really pragmatic. I'm like, what are the steps? So like, what is the thing you want to do? Then what are the steps to get there? And people joke, and it's true, I love a spreadsheet, and I will actually make spreadsheets for various projects so that it gives me structure. My studio practice is the place where structure it goes away so that I can explore freely. But in order to accomplish a goal, I know how to build the structure to get there. So whether or not I've ever done it before, I know how to research, I know how to find the information, look at examples from other people doing the thing. There's this great quote by Robert Henry that is like, okay, I hope I can remember it because it's so beautiful. It's like, if you want to know how to do a thing, go to others who have done that thing, kindred spirits, then like share that thing with others. Like there's this, I'll look it up for you and send it to you, but it's so beautiful because it's about the idea that you look for people who have already done it, learn from them. And once you know how to do it, you have a responsibility then to share that with others so that they can have a path too. And I always I feel that so deeply in me. And I think I live by that too. And that's part of why teaching was important. It's part of why leadership within Sika is important. And it's part of why if somebody reaches out to me, I generally try to get back to them as soon as possible of like, yeah, here, let me tell you what I know. And I don't hold attachment to competition or fear that someone's going to do it better than me or anything, because of course they are. That's going to happen. So then my goal is just to do it in the best way that I can. And sharing information just means that somebody else has a chance to also succeed. And I just really believe in that deeply.
Do you think that comes from like a family upbringing or a religious past, or how do you feel like you have this faith in yourself and humanity?
It's a real faith in humanity for sure. I think it comes from a few different things, possibly. My parents both really, they both had, there was like fear in the way that they raised us because they were concerned about like physical harm always, like don't go to that cliff edge when we would go hiking or things like that. But there was also a belief and real sense of like, well, you can do anything. So like my dad would teach me how to fix our cars growing up. So I know a lot about fixing ball bearings and lots of things, or packing ball bearings, I should say. So doing things like that. So like my family just always believed that we were capable of doing things. So that was part of it. I also had a grandmother who was a leader in her own small township in northern Wisconsin. And she was like the clerk of their town for many, many years. And so I saw her lead in this. It was like a tiny, tiny rural township, but it was important what she did. And she helped that township fight for its rights at one point around having stricter environmental protections than the state had. And she was a plaintiff in a case that kept going, and it went all the way to the US Supreme Court where they won. And so their little tiny township was allowed to have a stronger environmental law than other places in the state. So I had those kinds of examples of like, it doesn't matter where you are, you can make a difference and you can do something that aligns with what you care about. And I think that seeing that was really critical in sort of my own internal belief and my understanding about what it means to be in this world with other people.
I love that example of your grandmother. I mean, also how amazing that the case got all the way to the Supreme Court, because that establishes precedent for local control of a lot of things.
Right.
But also it just reminds me, like, all of our generations were filled with badass people that we don't always know about, you know? So like when you probably learned that later in life, you knew your grandmother just as your loving grandmother.
She was a beast. Yeah. A loving one. Sorry.
Well, it's just, this is a tangent, but I love learning about older generations, all the things they've accomplished.
It is. And you're right. Like that case, I was looking into it again recently, and it is still used as precedent and it's used over and over again. And she just passed in early 2020. And so I think that's when I was looking into it and just even talking with people in the community, and they all were like, oh, Mary Emerson, we know her. And it was just like, not a big place, but made an impact. And like, I do think I think that's also why I live in a rural setting in Wisconsin, and I believe in that there's a path for me to still have impact and contact with the world outside of the small community, that I don't have to be in a metropolitan hub in order to do that. It's different, of course, but I believe it can be done from anywhere.
I think living in a small town, you have a lot of skin in the game. You know, like people, they know you. If you're involved in county politics or township politics, you're actually making a difference, because if you don't do it, who's going to do it?
Things just stay the same if no one does anything. Like that's really what happens.
How did you first get involved with using terracid as an artist? And then how did that transition into like, hey, I'm going to write a book about this?
I first got into terracid gelata, and I write this story in the introduction of the book, but there was a old lunchroom mayonnaise container, one of those bigger ones that's like 16 inches tall and good volume. And it was like on the bottom of the shelf, and it just said terracid on it. And I was like, oh, what's this? So I just, as an undergrad does, pulled it off the shelf, put it on a piece of Bisqueware, which like really good choice. So it's on Bisqueware, and then I pit fired it after that. And the funny thing is that piece still stands. I still have it in my studio, and the sidge did not peel off. And as I write in the book, it's because the sidge was really thin. It wasn't actually what we would have as on a technical side where you want it. So it worked in this way that it shouldn't have. But that was the first time that I started using it. And it was just out of a like, maybe I'll try this and see kind of approach. And then in terms of how I got to the book, I had 3 kids, and my youngest was, if I think right, I want to say she was maybe 2. And then that would mean that my older ones were 4 and 5 at the time, somewhere in there. They're very close in age. And I was kind of needing some inspiration over a J term when I wasn't teaching. So I was teaching adjunct at the time. And I took Molly Hatch's online workshop called Think Big, which I think you were a part of that whole series too.
I was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I took that, and I remember a lesson on writing books and thinking about what is the book that our community needs and doesn't have. And I just kind of slept on it. And then the next day I was like, terracid gelata, I know about that. And we don't have a book on that. We have paragraphs, we have handouts that are given from one person to the next person, but there's no collective book in a way. And so then, as I do, I researched how to make a book proposal, and I brought together a bunch of different resources from publishing houses that had their like process online. And then I wrote my book proposal, I think in that day, honestly. kind of slept on it, edited it the next day, and then sent it to Sherman Hall, who was the editor over at like Ceramics Art Networks at the time, because I knew him through a committee I had served on within SICA. So it's all kind of through connections. I thought, well, I'll try with Sherman first and see what happens. Um, and he wrote back within a day and was like, yes, I'd love to do this project with you. And then he's like, I would just alter a couple things on the outline. And I was like, okay. So that was, which I knew was not typical at all, to have that experience. And I'm so grateful. And, some of it comes from knowing one another, of course. And I also have to think that people put resources out online that I could pull from and really learn from to do this thing. So I submitted it and then started working on it from that point forward.
Yeah, and terracage is one of those things where, like, theoretically you're taught about slips and terracage in a beginning class. But what your book does, what I like, is that it expands into, it's not just for old ancient pottery. I think I was even taught in the context of this was used in historical ceramics, so we're going to use it so you can know what they used. But it wasn't taught as in this is something you can do every day. Like this is a living, breathing thing now.
Yes.
How did you get that part into the book? Like the contemporary, in fact, I actually think the title is Terracage Contemporary Techniques, right?
It is, which is sort of funny because like the techniques haven't changed that much over time. So it's really only contemporary because we're doing it now. But I got to that place because of grad school, honestly. So I went to grad school at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and there was Pete Pinnell, Gail Kendall, and Eddie Dominguez were my three mentors. And Pete, of course, was teaching a lot about terra sigillata to people, and a lot of my cohort and in the, kind of the 3 years of us that are there at the same time, were using them and they were making colors with them. And I thought, oh my gosh, colors? Like, what is this? And then for my clay and glaze calc class, I chose terra sigillata as my project. And I worked on that with a fellow classmate, Caitlin Applegate. And we worked on it together and started testing things. And then, so that's really where I understood like, oh, you can use these differently. And then as I was building sort of the concept and the mission, I think of it more maybe as the mission of the book, is my mission of the book was to let people know you can use this in so many different ways, because I was also taught like it's only in these low fire, pit fire kind of traditional ways of using it. But I was seeing people using it in electric kilns at low fire. And I started doing low fire soda with it. And then other people were doing that as well. And then you can use it in all the high fire kilns. And I was also a wood firer at that time in my life. And so I was using it in high fire wood fire kilns in onagamas and naborigamas. And that I had one material surface that could work across temperature ranges was such an amazing thing. And I wanted other people to know they could do that too. And that was really why the book included contemporary artists and also emphasized like every temperature range this can be used in some way.
Yeah, and I actually don't even think of that broad spectrum. And I'm glad to hear you say this, because in my mind, you fire it above a certain temperature and it changes quality. So I've always been interested in like the real waxiness of it, which is like a low fire quality. But when you start getting higher and higher, I mean, in a way, a flashing slip is not that different than a terracid, right? I mean, isn't that kind of what it is?
It absolutely is. And that was what I really loved too, is that it was like a flashing slip, because I had been raised, if you will, on flashing slips in my undergrad experience. And I loved what they did, but I didn't like how they always obscured textures. And terra sigillata, because it is thinner, it really highlights those textures. And then often I found it to be even more flashing in variety in those high fire temperatures, especially in the atmospheric kilns, because of the small particle size of the terra sigillata. And then also because the colorants that you put into terra sigillata are more free, and they're not like chemically bound. They're physically bound, but not chemically bound, where in a slip, you start to get chemical bonds happening. And so they're not as free to move and do things. And so it allows them to do that inside the kiln and give more variety. Porcelain with terra sigillatas in a wood kiln will flash like just a beautiful amount. Like those ones stunned me. When I saw them, I was like, okay, here we are.
Don't you feel like in ceramics, there's like so many different things you could do?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
it's shocking.
I have to learn to be a better editor when you're like listing all the things I do. Sometimes I'm like, well, maybe you should try to just do one of the things, but also like I am all these things. Like this is me.
Well, just hearing you talk about terracage and a wood kiln, I'm like, I could spend years on that, even though I'm a low-fire potter. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yes. Yes, I do.
And I think it just kind of proves the point is that you follow your interest. As an artist, we follow our interest and let that direct us kind of in different paths. And in your art making career, you've, as I've said, you've made pots, you've made sculpture, but you also have done a lot of things that are kind of sort of project oriented things that are, I'm sure they're connected in your mind, but they're kind of one-offs. Let's talk about the one where you used hammocks that was during the pandemic. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So I want to start with this too, that when I graduated from my MFA, my thesis, my work there was ceramics. And then I also had graphite drawings and some sculptural drawings that were done with wire. And I remember one of my mentors in that thesis defense said, if someone asks you, what kind of artist are you? Because you use all these materials. And I said, well, I'm an artist who follows my idea first and the materials come second. So that's whatever materials are needed to convey that idea or that thing that I'm thinking about, I'll go with. Which sometimes I feel like, as someone who's a leader in our ceramics community through NCECA, I'm like, oh, is that like, should I be so open? But that's the truth. Like I'm always idea generated first. So the hammock project that you're talking about, it was in 2019, actually, in September. So just the fall before the pandemic, and I was turning 40 and I wanted to do something just to kind of like gather friends and celebrate. And a few years prior to that, I had met the artist Janine Antoni, and she talked to me about building a score. And I was so fascinated by this thought of like, what would my score be for something? So like a musical score, performance score, like what would that be? And so I had that thought kind of always carried with me, and I had been kind of rolling it around, as I say. And my mom was sitting with me on our back deck, and I live in a wooded hillside, and we were looking at our hammock, and she's like, oh, for all the trees we have in our yard, we don't have a good pair for a hammock. And she's like, you have so many. How many do you think you could have? And I was like, oh, at least 50 or so, I bet, because I was kind of glancing at our woods, which is a beautiful mature oak and maple wooded hillside. And so it started with that. And then that was around Easter time of that year. And then I just kind of thought like, like I could take this idea of a score. I could put together, an invitation to friends and build this hammock and these hammocks or hammock installation and ask them to come and do something with me and do that. The hammock shape is a shape that references the kind of forms that I make in clay too. So a lot of my friends were like, you got to be in your forms. Like, yes, I did. And I also really love the idea of these white hammocks in the way that they visually would stand out against the green of the hillside. So there was this visual consideration, and I asked people to dress in neutral colors, which for my older sister was a challenge. She was like, I don't own anything that's neutral. I know.
Well, what got me was the visual part of it. Like I saw this on your website, the white and the green, as you're mentioning, because of the way that they're strung in the trees, they're going at slightly different angles. And there's this like sense of distance that you get that's just really interesting as a sculpture. Not even the fact that they're functional hammocks that you can lay down in, just the visual sculpture of it was really nice.
Yeah, thank you. When I had them hanging too for the day, I tested it out kind of days before the event and stuff. I was videoing them with the wind, and I thought of it like drawing with the wind. Like it's a real live interaction happening. And then I also spent time in every single hammock solo, and then would document kind of my experience looking up. And so I have this series of photographs of like 23 views basically of trees too. And I think about what that might become at some point in the future in a piece. And at the same time, this piece came out of an interest. I was reading a book by Priya Parker called The Art of Gathering: How We Meet and Why It Matters. And I love the idea of intentional gathering of people. And so that was also what I was kind of integrating and implementing, was the things I had learned from that book of how do I bring people together. And I knew I wanted to give people the gift of time and space, and the time of creativity, and the time of togetherness. And so those were my intentions of what this piece would be. And so it's a piece that I want to do again. It's one of the challenges is the physicality of it. It requires a location that can support hammocks being in space. There's a small school nearby that I'm actually going to do it with in the fall with a bunch of high schoolers. Their class level is like 20 students per grade level, so very small. And they have this art teacher who really likes to invite artists in. And so I want to bring that project there because one, they'll be like, this is art. And then like two, just the chance to work with youth is really exciting, in rural youth and in particular, kind of seeing the need to have access to different kinds of art than what they think it is.
Yeah, and it's art that feels good. Like when you lay in a hammock, there's a sense of relaxation, but you also can do it like how did being in the group and everyone being in the hammock, how did that shift the way people interacted after they got out of the hammock? Like, do you think it had an effect?
I do. I led them through it in a specific way of, we first met up and I introduced my intention to them as the first part of the score. So we gathered on my back deck together. I did an intro and talked. I wrote a script for everything because I wanted to be very specific. And then the rules, if you will, of being in the hammock was that you had to be silent, but you could use your phone to document, you could draw, you could sketch, you could rest with a blanket, you could sleep if you wanted to. I rang a bell at 10-minute increments so people knew the passage of time, because sometimes for people with anxiety, not knowing how much time has passed is really difficult. So all throughout the hosting is thinking about how you're caring for those people that are experiencing it too. So marking time was a way to care. So first they were individualized, and then we had another segment of time where they got to make work in reflection, which was still done solo, not together. So then we have two sections of doing things independently. And then the third section, we came together to talk about the experience. And then it was a potluck, so we ate food together. So a very ceramics-y kind of thing was to ask everyone to bring something. But then we were eating food as food opens conversation. And so then we use the food as a modality to talk with one another, to reflect on the experience. And it was people that were artists, non-artists whatsoever. My dad did it. My sisters did it. My husband did it. Like people who normally don't do art with me were doing this with me. And so having both kinds of language being shared, a lot of my friends who are non-artists said, hearing artists talk about their experience and putting words to it was so unique to the way that I didn't know how to express what I was feeling. And I learned through their expression. And then at the end, I always liked benedictions in church because it was like the blessing to everyone, like as you leave the gathering. And so I used a Mary Oliver poem basically as my benediction to everyone. And then made small heart-shaped ceramic pieces with terra sigillata or stones that they could take as a literal touchstone back to that time of presence and that time of rest in the experience. So bringing everything together in that way.
And it fits the score, the idea of the score, as you mentioned before, like you're doing almost a prelude, an event. I'm sure the sound of the bell, that's interesting, because I like that idea that marking time is showing care. I've never really thought about it. I've done a lot of meditation in groups and by myself, and I've noticed that too. People are very scared by silence.
Yes.
And so if there is not a structure, silence feels chaotic. But if there is a structure, people like calm down. You know what I mean?
They do.
Like instantly.
Yeah. And I wonder if you and I share this or not, but like being an independent artist, because I went from teaching for 11 years to being in my studio and learning that like spending time alone with yourself, like for me is a really rich place to be. I love both experiences, of course, but I know that for some people, being alone with themselves is not so wonderful. And so thinking about the opportunity of a space to allow people to be alone with themselves, but with others. I mean, like that whole alone together is true. And I still think about the timing of this event and then that phrase became such a phrase for us during the pandemic and how it shifted in its meaning, the depth of its meaning, I think, over time too.
Yeah, and actually, I assumed that the piece was during the pandemic because it was called Alone Together. So
Oh.
it's interesting how that phrase is now just a part of our lexicon in a way.
Yeah, and that phrase I would say was gifted to me from one of my other friends who's an artist. And she said, I just feel like you need to know this phrase of alone together. It's like something you talk about a lot. And so that was like I feel like she gifted me that phrase to be able to use it then through this piece.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art. The collection exists as an online resource for research and inspiration, featuring photos of over 4,000 objects made by over 1,000 artists. The images are high quality and can be used with no permission required, making them a great resource for students and teachers. To find out more, visit rosenfieldcollection.com.
The Bray Clay business is your best source for Braypoxy, a two-part moldable epoxy intended for post-firing repairs. Working like clay, it's easy to shape, texture, fill gaps, and recreate missing parts. Braypoxy is sold in tan, white, and black base colors, and we also have a 9-color kit that will allow you to perfectly disguise your repair. Order online anytime at archiebrayclay.com.
So you mentioned that being in the hammock, people were like, hey, this is kind of similar to the pots that or the big sculptural kind of trays that you make. Can you talk about your interest in that? It's kind of like there's a couple forms that repeat in your body of work. One is like a hammock, like a long elongated oval that comes to a point. And then another that you do that's really beautiful is like you'll have multiple circles that will be attached together, but they're in differing distances apart from each other. So can you talk about your interest in shape, looking down on something, the shape you see, and how that is creating the vessels, or how that's accomplished by creating the vessels?
I think a lot of times I think in 2D and I create in 3D. And so a lot of times that's where the shapes sometimes flatten, is because they're the way that I see them in the 2 dimension. And that's where sort of my ideas always start for me. And so, and I think that the elongated vessels that are more long and oval, like, and come to the points, those ones to me relate to 2 animals that I really love, which are the giraffe and the flamingo. And they both have these sort of weird elongated proportions where things don't seem like they should balance, and yet they do. And so I think that it's a sensibility that just for some reason I really enjoy. And so that's where that kind of exaggeration comes from, or that exploration in there. And then those smaller, rounder, ovular ones, those are actually like the negative space of the palm of the hand when it's in a cup form for me. And so when I hold those objects, I actually love to hold them and pass them to someone as an offering. And so I'm always thinking about these objects as being an offering to whoever is going to live with them. So it is a gift of space, a gift of holding something. And that's where the root of those is in that feeling and that concept of wanting to give.
Yeah, and the forms have a primalness to them that I think relates to gourds. Like they look as if they could be gourds. And I think the sidge, actually, the surface kind of reinforces that. But the image that you have in my book is of those forms with food in them, and they are amazing with food because you have the color of the food, you have this beautiful like blue-black sidge, like it is just right on. So how do you think about the sort of act of eating or the food being a completion of the form?
I think that that's one version of how they get to be used and exist. And so the food part is like that rooted of sharing and of community and of family. So the experience of, for me, a lot is rooted in my past of like family being together. And I come from a large family. I was just telling someone recently, I have like over 30 first cousins, and like,
Whoa.
yeah, yeah,
That's a lot.
it is a lot. My dad is one of 9 and my mom is one of 5. And so inherently that we have a lot of a lot of people in our family. And I think that that communal sense of gathering has always been a big part of my life, and the sharing of food then is also part of that. And so when they're used in that way, to me, they speak to that experience of being together, of sharing together and all of that. And then I also know that people who live with them use them in meditation rooms, and that they will put special stones and things into them, and they're used as these sacred objects, which also is really, I love the idea of the sacred, and that the sacred is simply something that is you want to hold and you want to care for, and that in a way there's a little bit of protection about it, like where it is something that is special that you don't want to lose in some way. And so that for me also really resonates in their use. I used to joke when people would say, "What do I use them for?" I'm like, you can just put your socks in them, like just fold up some socks, like, because I just thought like that means they can be for anything. Like we have some in our garage that are holding bolts. I mean, they are used in a lot of way. I mean, those are not the greatest ones, of course, that are holding the bolts, but they do work. But just that it's whatever you need. It's when you need a place to hold something. That is what that vessel is for me. And I always joke, or not joke, this one's more serious. I just still say like, but it also can be to hold space. And that phrase is something that gets used a lot or kind of overused, like I'm holding space for. But there is a great power when we hold space for someone or something, whether they know it or not. It's just like the idea that we could imagine in any moment when it might be hard that there's people out in the world holding space for us and we don't even know that they're doing it. And so if you can pause for a minute and allow yourself that you might feel some comfort. And so I think about holding space in that way.
You're making me think about parenting because I have a 2-year-old, and this idea of creating space, meaning that I'm trying to shape her without her knowing that. What are we like teaching, like A plus B equals C teaching, or what are we teaching just because we're creating an environment that will inevitably teach her things like to trust herself and things to like take risks, like all of those things are better to be taught in an environmental way than they are to be taught in like a, this is how you do it kind of way.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think about the sacred with your children? Like, have you tried to teach them about that?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the way in which that maybe I was taught about the sacred, and that it is noticing anything at any moment. I think my parents were really great at doing that with us and like pointing out as simple as something that is of interest in the land around you at any given moment. And, even kind of touching back to when you mentioned gourds and that relationship to the forms, my childhood was spent in the earth, was spent in nature, was spent looking, exploring, touching. And so I think that with my own kids, that's my husband and I both really believe in like that beauty is everywhere, and that the practice of just pointing something out, talking about what we see. Some of my sort of like heart-filling moments as a parent have been when my kids will be like, "Come look at the sunset. It is beautiful." And I'm like, yes, they're doing it on their own. They're doing it on their own. And that hasn't come from either of us going, "Hey, let's talk about how great the sunset it is and how important it is in that moment." It's been truly to be captivated by the awe and the wonder of it ourselves. And like I can still find incredible beauty in every little thing that might be out in my yard. Or I was just in New York and there were so many things there, of course, to be captivated by, but being able to take time to notice those things, I think that's part of the practice of teaching my kids about the sacred, is teaching them to notice and to pause to notice enough to say it to someone else. The phrase bearing witness also comes from like religion, but also is really beautiful. And the thought of like, we bear witness to our lives around us, to the land we are with, and to the people we are with, and sharing something like what we notice is a way to bear witness to each other's experience. And I really think that that is part of sacredness too. And I use a lot of religious language, but I'm not a practicing church going person. But I think there's like beauty in those words of what the root of them is. And so they feel true to me still.
It's very interesting how pottery has now become a part of your practice of the sacred. I would imagine because you're making these vessels that are part of other people's practice in the meditation room or in the kitchen.
Yeah, and even that 11, I don't know if you saw this or not. I don't think it's on my website yet, but the 11 minutes of gratitude practice that I started that during the pandemic, just after that first year of all three of our kids were suddenly home with me every single day, all day long. And my husband works in the lumber industry, and so he still had to report to work. And so we had that real shift of like where time and attention went. And when they finally started going back to school in person, I needed a new transition. I'm really big on also honoring what kind of transition is needed from one mindset to the other, because I do so many different things. So I build ways to practice that transition. And so I just thought, I was like, oh, okay, I'm just going to sit down for 11 minutes, pinch these small pots that have always been something really important to me, but I maybe don't always fully understand the depth of their importance. And then I also wanted to come to my practice every day in a mindset of gratitude, because I had had a year of getting to actually work every day in my studio. And then the pandemic happened and I was like, that was how it felt. I was like, oh no, I was just getting going. And so I wanted to come to this space with the gratitude of like, I am so grateful for the access to time to be in here. And so I did these 11 minutes. It was a random number, but I did start on January 11th. So maybe that was why. I'm also big on making things manageable. So 11 minutes was like what I could commit to, and just pinching pots for 11 minutes, with each pot thinking about a person or a thing that I was grateful for, or an experience. And so then I started that, and then I kept a logbook because my grandfather had a logbook of the weather and who came to visit every day. And I like the idea of this logbook of things, of record keeping. And someone just shared with me, this artist, Anders Dixon, who I was staying with in New York. And he said there's some research around that people who live in rural places where they don't have a lot of contact with many people, actually, there's like this whole vein of them keeping logbooks as a way to keep a structure or a connection to something that is outside of themselves. So a lot of them were the weather. Sometimes they were the animals they saw. And so I was like, oh, this opens up a whole new meaning to like why the logbook is maybe important. So, and that practice is one I do with people as workshops, and then also just as other one-off events with people.
And that idea of the logbook, I actually think your surface design sometimes reminds me of that, like repetitious mark making as a way of like making a notch on something, like when people count days or count whatever you're counting.
Yeah.
Is that what it is? Is that the connection?
No, the surfaces came from when I used to commute and I was driving behind a semi truck that had different shapes of PVC pipes on it. And it was such a beautiful grid. I made a painting about it first, and then I was like, why don't you put this on your form? So like, maybe you should do that. But the repetition while I'm doing it is definitely that soothing kind of experience of like, I'm just making the circle. I'm making the circle. This is time. This is time. Like, it's definitely the process of it is that. The imagery came from this other place, but the process is definitely that.
Well, I wanted to transition and talk about your podcast, where you're often having conversations about meaning. Like, I've noticed as a podcast host, like you want to know, like, where's the creativity from? In fact, I think I've even seen you describe it as you're tracking or tracing creativity.
Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about the title?
Yeah.
Because it is a super unique title.
It is. It's called The Artist in Me is Dead. And it came from a former student, and her name is Lisa Vang, and she's the first guest on the podcast too. And Lisa she was one of those students, like I can still remember one of her very first pieces in Intro to Ceramics. It was this great cut apart cylinder that was altered to reference like an Asian screen. And then on it were these little fish drawings, and they were representing different family units. So same sex, mixed gendered, all of like, and she wanted to make a commentary on that, but through this way that people wouldn't recognize maybe at first. So that's like a little history about her and her standing out. So she came back to visit after graduating, and she walked into the room and like just proclaimed this, like, the artist in me is dead, Rhonda. And it was like, what do you mean? And so she shared though, like the challenge of making art when you're not in school and not in the structure. And so that was like where the phrase came from. And then as I was transitioning out of teaching, I was talking with the students that I was working with at the time, and they were like, they were like, what are you going to do? And so we were talking about things. I'm like, I don't know, maybe a podcast about this idea of like when your creativity gets kind of like stuck and what do you do? And I just remember this one student, I'm blanking on his name right now. I can see his face. And he was just like, I would listen to that if you did that. And I was like, okay. So it's like one of those things where I'm like, okay. And so Lisa, of course, as I was running through names for the podcast, then that phrase came back. And so I checked in with her again, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking of doing this. Can I use this phrase? And like, would you come on? And she was like, yeah. So then that's really where it came from. And also because I kept seeing like my students, we spent a lot of time at the beginning of each class in studio ceramics talking, just like 15 minutes, like, let's just talk about what are the concerns of our creativity right now. And out of that came so much of this of like, what does somebody do while they're trying to make it? Like while they're trying to still gain that success, or what happens when you kind of step away from it? Can you still call yourself an artist? Which so many people feel that feeling. And I also was noticing that in a lot of other podcasts in the field, like we were talking to people who were at a really great place in their practice. They were really successful, and they were, having the opportunities they had dreamed of, kind of thing. And I wanted to talk to people when they're kind of uncomfortable. And it's a very vulnerable place to ask people to come and talk and share with. And definitely some people are like, I'm not ready. I can't do that yet. And I was like, that's okay. Like, this is really like, because it's trust. You have to trust me to hold you with that story through that conversation, where it is when we feel maybe the worst about our creativity sometimes when I'm talking with people. And I just felt like it was important to tell those stories, to share those stories of people in that time period of their creativity, because so many people feel very alone. And it goes back to that feeling of shame and how that holds people in smaller rather than allowing them to grow and expand. And so by sharing that, then people feel, again, less alone and feel more connected, and like, oh, somebody else is struggling with that. And what are they doing? How are they finding it? Yeah. And so that's where it started, and why.
And the power of identification is really helpful for students, but I also think I think I'm mid-career. I don't know how. I'm not emerging.
I know.
I'm somewhere in the middle, but I feel like for people and we're kind of in the same generation, after you have the first sort of layer of success, then what? Then what's the thing?
Yes.
Like, do you start a completely different body of work? Like, how does this even work? So I like that you're often like I was listening to the woman from Cincinnati that does,
Pam Kravitz. Yes.
And she does a little of everything. Like she's done everything from kind of yarn-based or fabric-based work to murals to ceramics to like she's done it all. So one of the things I liked about that interview is just this idea that like whatever you will, for one, just follow the creativity. Wherever it takes you, follow it. But also just to hear someone that's very established say like, I've done all these different things and I'm going to do something different next.
She's in a play right now. She is, yeah. Just texting with her the other day, and she's like, I got to get to rehearsals. Yeah. And so I had to pause it here this spring. Life just got wild with our family and with things where normally I would keep going and I just couldn't. Like that's the other reality is like prioritizing with so many interests and so many things, like when things shift and move. And that one I had to set aside. Honestly, though, actually, because it's a passion project. I don't earn revenue from it at this time. I would like to. And so when I'm thinking about that realistically, I had to say, like, right now you have to work on these things that are adding income at the moment, and you can come back to that again in the fall. And like I want to be honest about that because I think that people, we like my goal always is to try and fund different parts of my interest through other parts of the work that I do. And so I'm thinking in that way about it too. Like, okay, if I work on this particular thing, then that gives me income that allows me some time and space to work on that particular project. So that's actually what happened with the podcast this spring. So it's on pause, but I still have like 5 episodes to edit for season 2. So hopefully through the summer, I'll get back to it here and then launch those in the fall to finish it up. It's just purely because I believe in the idea of sharing these particular stories. That's really what it is.
And we've talked a little about the work that you've done with NSECA. You've been on multiple levels of the organization, including being the president. There's times in which your life you could be doing other things, but you're doing NSECA service work. Can you talk about how you prioritize sort of service-based work with the things like studio work or family time?
Maybe I'll start with family time for a second. So my kids are, let's see, we're at 13, 12, and 9.5 right now. And one of the things a couple years ago, I just sort of had this, it was probably when we were just starting to get back to doing things and being more busy. And I thought, you know what, whenever they ask me to show up, I'm going to show up. Like whether that's a field trip or something, and I'm going to prioritize that first. And I know that sounds kind of basic, but I think that was a really important pause to give myself and go like, you're going to show up for those things because this time will go quickly and it will be fun to do it most of the time. Uh, but I just knew that that was one way, for example, that I wanted to show up for them. And so with that in mind, then I'm like, okay, so field trip days, I always block off of my calendar or other events. Like just, I block that off as I'm not going to be in the studio and I'm also not going to take meetings on those days. Then for service work, that has varied a lot. During the pandemic, it required, I started on the second round of service in 2018. I had served earlier in 2000, what was it, 2008 to 2000 or 2009 to 2012, somewhere in there, I think was my first round of service as a director at large on the board. And then I stepped away because I was having my children during that time and working and teaching. And so I just couldn't do quite all the things. And then in 2018, I was asked to kind of come back in this board steward role and all of that. And then the pandemic happened. And during the pandemic, we were meeting daily for a bit of time, then weekly, and then monthly. And then it stayed monthly for quite a while for the full board. And then I was involved in a lot of the other logistical meetings along the way with specialists, with just whoever we needed with our tech team that we were going to try to produce the first virtual conference. And I was really hands-on during that time because the organization I felt needed me to be in that way. And I had committed to being a part of it during this time of my life. So I wanted to show up in the way I said I would show up. My high school guidance counselor would have said, like, if you ask Rhonda to do something, she will do it 100%. She won't just like kind of show up. She'll like be there the whole way. And I think that that is a true thing. I feel a lot of responsibility to when I say yes to something. So I don't say yes unless I really can be fully present and do the work that I need to do. So I think that's the starting place of it all. As we got out of the pandemic and time has changed, I still have standing weekly meetings, and then I have our quarterly meetings with our board too, and then our twice a year in-person meetings that we do, and I help out with those quite a bit. But what I started doing as things were lightening is I tried to consolidate so my meetings were on 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And that way, Monday, Wednesday, Fridays became more of studio day or family life day, depending on what was going on. So I'm also really big into structure. And so I make myself structures when I need something. And so that was a structure I started for myself in the last year of like, okay, Tuesday, Thursdays are going to be your NCCA days. You just know that you're going to do a lot of meetings, emails, and follow-ups and things that you're doing. If I have to, if there's an important meeting on another day, then I say yes to those, of course, but I try to be as much as possible, keep them there. And it is hard because it's been on average 20 hours a week that I spend towards that. And then that is 20 hours a week that are not in the studio. And the weekends now with our family at the ages we are at, my studio is maybe accessible to me for a couple hours on the weekends if we happen to be home, but we're not often home anymore. So, I mean, kind of to the prioritization, I try to block out time. I have a planner that I really like, and every week I take time on like Sunday to lay out the week ahead and kind of look at, here are the blocks of time. This is what I'm going to use them for. And I try to stick to that. But then, I'm also flexible where if life happens, like I always say, life is life. It's going to happen. And sometimes you just have to be ready to go with it.
Yeah. And making a plan and then abandoning it are also good,
Yes.
Because I think if I don't have a plan, I get a little anxious. Like I need an anchor.
Yes.
So the plan is the anchor. But then with my daughter or my wife, sometimes will have things where I'm just like, okay, that plan's gone out the window.
Yep. My mom told me when our kids are really small and I was struggling to grocery shop with all three of them, I was like, I don't know how to do this. It was before grocery pickup was really popular and we can't get delivery. She goes, just know sometimes you just got to bail, Rhonda. I'm like, what? And she goes, you just leave the cart and you get out.
Oh man, I've been so close to bailing on a cart about a month ago, and Zosha got out of the cart. She was screaming. Then she was crawling on the ground behind the cart, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to leave. We're just gonna have to leave. But somehow we went into the other aisle, and she totally calmed down, and we stayed.
Oh my God. That's also, that is what raising children is. Like one moment it's like, oh my gosh, we gotta go. And then it's like, but I'm okay. We're fine.
By the time they get to the car, they're like little monks and they're calm and you're like,
where was this when we were inside?
Yeah. Well, to wrap up, can you plug the title of the book and where people can get it and also the podcast?
Sure. Yeah. So the book is Terra Sigillata, Contemporary Techniques, and you can buy it through Amazon, fast and easy. You can also get it through Ceramic Art Network, also fast and easy, and they occasionally offer sales. So keep an eye out for those. And then the podcast is The Artist in Me is Dead, and it's on pretty much all the platforms. I primarily use Apple podcast stuff and Spotify, but you can get it anywhere.
Also, your Instagram so that people could follow along.
Sure. My Instagram, the primary one I'll direct you to is @R_Willers, WILLERS. Go there and then you can get to everywhere else.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Ben. I really appreciated talking with you.
I'd like to thank Rhonda for coming on the show. It was great to chat with her about all the different facets of her career. I hope that you will check out her podcast, The Artist in Me is Dead, which is available on all major podcast apps. Before we go, I'd like to thank today's sponsors. That includes the Rosenfield Collection of Functional Ceramic Art, Cornell Studio Supply, and Bray Clay. If you or your organization is interested in becoming a sponsor, you can get in touch at brickyardnetwork.org. I'll be back next week with another episode. Thank you all for tuning in. If you'd like more information on the artists on the show, or if you'd like more information about the workshops and events that I'll be having in the next couple months, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook under Carter Pottery. Another great way to support the show is to leave me a comment on iTunes. To do that, search Tales of a Red Clay Rambler under iTunes Podcasts, and you'll find a page that's linked to our show. Thank you guys for the support.